When Daniel sent that invitation, he thought it would be the final humiliation, the perfect revenge against the woman he once called his wife. She was supposed to arrive broken, in rags, begging for mercy. But when Clara stepped out of that Rolls Royce in a silk gown, with 3 little children holding her hands, every pair of eyes turned, and Daniel realized he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. It was a crisp spring morning when the letter arrived, sealed in ivory paper and gold ink. Clara almost didn't open it at first. The handwriting was too familiar, sharp, elegant, precise, the kind that made her chest tighten with old memories. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. Inside was a single card. Mr. Daniel Whitmore requests the pleasure of your company at his wedding to Miss Emily Sinclair. Ceremony to be held at the Grand Belrose Hotel, Saturday, 4 p.m. There was no signature. None was needed. For a moment, she just stood there by the kitchen window, the sunlight catching the faint traces of flour on her apron. Her little bakery was quiet that morning, the scent of fresh bread still warm in the air. She read the invitation again, slower this time. Her lips pressed into a thin line. It had been 4 years since Daniel had left her. 4 years since he'd walked out of their small flat in Manchester with nothing more than a cruel laugh and the words, "You'll never make it without me." And now he wanted her to come to his wedding? Clara almost laughed. It was so like him, arrogant, theatrical, certain she'd show up just to see what she'd lost. But he didn't know what she'd found. The bell over the bakery door jingled, and 3 small voices filled the room. "Mummy, look what we made." 3 little figures tumbled in, 2 girls and a boy, identical smiles lighting up their faces. Their school uniforms were slightly untidy, their hands sticky with the remains of icing sugar. Clara knelt down, smiling. "Oh dear, what did you make this time?" "A cake," shouted Ellie, the eldest by 2 minutes. "It's for you. Because you worked too much," added Sophie. "And because we love you," finished Liam, grinning proudly. Clara's laughter rang softly through the bakery. "You 3 are trouble," she said, hugging them tightly. The children were her miracle, her reason to get up every morning, even when the world had felt like it was falling apart. She'd raised them alone, without a penny from Daniel, working double shifts and sleeping barely 4 hours a night. But she'd done it. Now her bakery, Clara's Hearth, was the heart of the little town. Locals came not just for the pastries but for the warmth she radiated, the way she treated everyone as if they mattered. She looked back at the invitation lying on the counter. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she wiped her hands, picked up her phone and called her best friend, Nora. When Nora answered, her voice came through bright and teasing. "Morning, darling. What's the emergency this time? Burned the croissants again?" Clara smiled faintly. "Not quite. I got an invitation." "To what?" "To Daniel's wedding." There was a long pause. Then, "He did not." "Oh, he did. Gold lettering and everything. Emily Sinclair, the one with the family money." "God, the audacity," Nora said, disgusted. "What are you going to do?" Clara looked out the window at the children playing on the pavement, sunlight glinting in their curls. "I'm going," she said simply. "Clara, no. I'm not going to make a scene. But he invited me for a reason, Nora. He wants to show off. He thinks I'm still the same woman he left, desperate and small. Maybe it's time he saw the truth." Nora sighed. "You're too kind for your own good." "Kindness isn't weakness," Clara said softly. "And sometimes the best revenge is just showing how far you've come." That night, after the children were asleep, Clara sat in her small living room, the invitation beside her. Her thoughts drifted to the past, the early days with Daniel when they'd been young and foolish, dreaming big dreams in a cramped flat. He'd been charming then, ambitious, full of promises. But ambition had turned to greed, and charm had curdled into cruelty. She remembered the night he'd left, the argument about money, his anger when she told him she wanted to start her bakery instead of continuing to depend on his income. He'd laughed at her. "Clara, you're a baker's daughter, nothing more. You think you can run a business? Be realistic." When she didn't back down, he'd walked out and never came back. It had taken her years to rebuild herself. She'd worked at a small cafe, saved every penny and opened her own shop. There had been days she'd cried in the storeroom, exhausted, but she'd kept going. Now, looking at that gilded invitation, she realized something. She wasn't afraid anymore. 2 weeks later, the day of the wedding arrived. The morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of day when even the air seems to hum with quiet importance. Clara dressed carefully, a soft silk gown in deep emerald that shimmered gently in the sunlight. It wasn't loud or ostentatious, but it fit her perfectly, elegant and confident. Outside, the gentle purr of an engine announced her arrival. The chauffeur, a kind man she'd known from the bakery, opened the door of the Rolls Royce she'd rented for the day. Her 3 children sat in the back, each dressed smartly. "Mummy, is this a princess car?" Sophie asked, eyes wide. Clara smiled. "Something like that." When they pulled up outside the Grand Belrose, conversation among the guests stopped. The Rolls Royce gleamed like silver in the sunlight, and when Clara stepped out, a hush fell. Whispers began almost instantly. "Is that Clara? She looks incredible. Isn't that Daniel's ex-wife?" Daniel himself stood at the entrance, laughing with a few groomsmen, until he saw her. The color drained from his face. He hadn't seen her since the divorce, hadn't imagined she'd look like this, poised, radiant, with 3 little children stepping out beside her, their tiny hands clutching hers. The murmurs grew louder. "Triplets," someone whispered. Clara caught Daniel's eye and smiled, calm, polite, unshaken. Then she took the children's hands and walked past him as if he were a stranger. Inside the ballroom, heads turned. Emily, the bride-to-be, noticed the commotion. When she followed everyone's gaze, her expression tightened slightly. Clara found her seat near the back, her children sitting quietly beside her. They were excited, wide-eyed, unaware of the tension surrounding them. Daniel approached her during the reception, his voice low and stiff. "I didn't think you'd actually come." "You invited me," she said simply. He gave a short, cold laugh. "I didn't expect you to arrive like that." His eyes flicked to the Rolls Royce parked outside. "Trying to impress me, Clara?" She smiled faintly. "Not at all, Daniel. Just being myself." He leaned closer, his words like venom. "You think showing up in a rented car makes you my equal? I wanted you here so you'd finally understand your place." She looked at him steadily. "Oh, I understand my place very well. The question is, do you?" For the first time he faltered. The music started then, saving him from having to respond. He straightened his tie and forced a smirk. "Enjoy the show. It's the closest you'll ever get to this kind of life." Clara turned away, her heart pounding, not with fear but with a quiet, steady pride. And before the night was over, he was going to find out just how wrong he'd been about the woman he'd left behind. For a while, the music and laughter filled the air, but it all felt like background noise to Clara. She sat quietly, her children nibbling at slices of cake, while the waiters glided between tables with trays of champagne. Every now and then she felt eyes on her. Curious glances, whispers passed between manicured guests who tried to hide their fascination. It didn't bother her. She'd lived through far worse than gossip. Then she saw him again. Daniel was making his rounds, greeting old business partners, shaking hands, smiling for photos. But every so often, his gaze would flick toward her, that same calculating look he used to have when he wanted to break her spirit without saying a word. She ignored him and focused on her children. "Mummy," Ellie whispered, tugging her sleeve, "is this where you used to live with Daddy?" Clara's smile softened. "No, sweetheart. We never lived here. But Daddy liked places like this." Sophie tilted her head, eyes curious. "Did he like you too?" Clara hesitated for half a heartbeat. "Once," she said finally. "But sometimes people forget what's important when they chase things that shine too brightly." Liam frowned. "Like the gold icing on our cake that didn't taste nice?" Clara chuckled quietly. "Exactly like that." Before she could say more, a familiar voice interrupted. "Well, if it isn't the woman of the hour," Nora said, sliding gracefully into the seat beside her. She looked stunning in a burgundy gown, her eyes full of mischief. "Sorry I'm late, the traffic was dreadful." Clara grinned. "I didn't think you'd actually come." "Oh please," Nora scoffed. "You think I'd miss seeing that man's face when he realizes what a fool he's been? Not a chance." Clara's laughter eased the tightness in her chest. Nora had been her rock through the worst days, when Daniel had left, when the bakery almost failed, when the twins were sick and she didn't have enough for medicine. Nora had always been there. Daniel approached again not long after, his arm around his new bride, Emily. Emily looked exactly as Clara remembered from the society pages. Tall, blonde, delicate, her every movement polished to perfection. But there was something guarded in her eyes, something that hinted she wasn't entirely at ease. "Clara," Daniel said smoothly, his tone dripping with false politeness. "I see you've brought company." Clara met his gaze evenly. "These are my children." Emily smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "They're adorable." "How old?" "3," Clara said. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Triplets? Impressive." He gave a sharp little laugh. "And the father?" Clara's lips curved slightly. Some questions don't deserve answers, Daniel. He blinked, taken aback by her calmness. Then he smirked. Still so secretive. You never did know how to play in the real world, Clara? I learned enough, she said softly. Just not the same lessons as you. Emily looked between them, her smile tightening. Darling, she said to Daniel, why don't we greet the investors? They've been waiting. Daniel nodded stiffly, but before turning away, he gave Clara one last smug glance. Try not to embarrass yourself, Clara. This isn't one of your little bake sales. When they walked off, Nora muttered under her breath, he's still the same arrogant toad. Clara smiled faintly, though her hands trembled slightly under the table. Let him enjoy his moment. It'll be the last time he ever looks down on me. Later, as the dinner began, a waiter approached her table with an envelope. From Mr. Whitmore, he said. Inside was a note. For old time's sake, let's have a toast. Meet me in the garden. Alone. Nora frowned when Clara showed it to her. Don't go. It's a setup. I know, Clara said quietly. But I'm done running from him. The garden behind the hotel was lit with strings of fairy lights and lanterns that glowed like tiny stars. The air smelled of roses and champagne. Daniel stood by the fountain, a glass in his hand, the perfect image of charm. Clara, he said as she approached. You always did like making an entrance. What do you want, Daniel? She asked simply. He tilted his head. Just closure. I wanted to see if you'd finally accepted your place. She folded her arms. My place. Yes, he said, stepping closer. The poor baker's wife. You tried to play at being something you're not, but we both know you were never meant for this world. Her jaw tightened. You left because you couldn't stand not being the hero in your own story. You needed someone smaller, someone who'd make you feel big. His smile faltered. You always did have a sharp tongue. And you always did mistake cruelty for confidence. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Daniel laughed softly. You're still angry. That's good. Anger means you still care. Clara shook her head. No, Daniel. Anger means I remember. But remembering isn't the same as caring. He raised his glass mockingly. To remembering then. And to the woman who could have had everything, if only she hadn't been too proud to stay in her lane. Clara's eyes glinted. Funny, I was just thinking the same about you. He frowned. What do you mean? But before she could answer, there was a voice behind them. Daniel? What's going on? Emily stood at the edge of the garden, her expression cold, her eyes narrowing as she looked between them. Darling, I was just. Spare me, she snapped. I've seen enough. She turned to Clara. I didn't believe the rumors, you know. That you left him because he cheated, that he ruined you financially. He told me you were unstable. But now I see who the liar really is. Clara blinked in surprise. Mrs. Sinclair. Please, Emily said quietly. It's Emily. And I think you've already won. She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Daniel speechless. Clara stood for a moment, then said softly, You reap what you sow, Daniel. When she returned to the ballroom, she found Nora waiting with a worried look. Well? Nora asked. Let's just say, Clara replied, the bride finally met the man behind the charm. As the evening wore on, Daniel's perfect facade began to crack. Emily avoided him, the guests whispered, and soon even his best man seemed unsure what to say. Clara, meanwhile, danced with her children, laughing freely for the first time in years. But the real moment came when the master of ceremonies announced the charity auction, an event meant to showcase the couple's generosity. One of the sponsors took the microphone. Tonight, we'd like to honor someone who's quietly changed lives in our community. A woman who built her business from nothing and now funds scholarships for single parents. Please welcome Miss Clara Whitmore. The crowd erupted in applause. Daniel's face froze. Clara stepped onto the stage, her smile gentle but steady. Thank you, she said into the microphone. When I started my bakery, I had nothing but an oven, a dream, and 3 little miracles. I wanted to prove that kindness and hard work can rebuild even the most broken life. Her gaze flicked briefly toward Daniel. Some people think wealth is about what you own. But true wealth is knowing who you are, and being proud of it. The applause that followed was thunderous. When she stepped down, Daniel couldn't even meet her eyes. For the first time, his arrogance looked small, fragile. Nora whispered, You handled that beautifully. Clara smiled. Revenge isn't about hurting someone, Nora. It's about healing yourself enough that their opinion no longer matters. Still, as she gathered her children to leave, she couldn't help glancing back one last time. Daniel stood alone by the table, staring into his untouched glass of champagne, the laughter around him fading into noise. He had wanted to disgrace her. Instead he had exposed himself. And the night was far from over. Because the next morning, the whole city would be talking, not about Daniel's wedding, but about the woman who had risen from the ashes, driving away in a Rolls Royce with her 3 little miracles by her side. The morning after the wedding, the tabloids were merciless. "The bride walked out, the EX stole the night," screamed one headline. "Baker outshines billionaire's wedding," said another. Daniel woke up to his phone vibrating endlessly on the nightstand. Missed calls, messages, and social media tags filled his screen like a storm. He groaned, pressing his palms against his face. Emily was gone. She hadn't come home after the argument. His father had called twice, furious about the embarrassment. And in every article, every photo, Clara looked radiant, smiling, composed, standing beside her triplets while he looked like a man on the verge of breaking. By mid-morning, Daniel's business partner, Henry, walked into his office with an expression that said everything. "You really outdid yourself this time," Henry muttered, dropping a newspaper onto the desk. Daniel scowled. "It's just gossip." "Gossip?" Henry snorted. "Your investors are pulling out. The Sinclairs are furious. Emily's father said you humiliated their family. You've got a PR disaster on your hands, mate." Daniel pushed the paper away. "This will blow over." Henry shook his head. "It won't. Not when half the city is suddenly buying from your ex-wife's bakery out of admiration. She's a local hero now. Clara Whitmore, the woman who built her empire from scratch while raising triplets." Daniel froze. "Empire?" Henry raised an eyebrow. "You really haven't been paying attention, have you? Clara's Hearth isn't just a bakery anymore. She's got 3 branches and a catering contract with several hotels, including the Belrose, by the way." Daniel's mind went blank. "You're joking." "Wish I were." Henry gave him a hard look. "You always said she'd never make it without you. Looks like she did better than you ever did with her." When Henry left, Daniel sat in silence, his pride crumbling bit by bit. He'd invited Clara to humiliate her, but somehow she turned it all around, gracefully, effortlessly. He thought about the Rolls Royce, the quiet confidence in her smile, the applause that had followed her speech. And those 3 little faces, all with his dark hair and her warm eyes. No. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. It couldn't be. That evening, unable to think of anything else, he drove to the small town where she lived. The sign for Clara's Hearth Bakery came into view, golden letters on a deep green background. The queue outside stretched down the street. He parked nearby, waited until the line thinned, and then stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed softly. The smell hit him first: butter, sugar, cinnamon, coffee. It was like stepping into another world, one he didn't belong in anymore. Clara was behind the counter, talking to a customer, her apron dusted with flour. When she looked up and saw him, her expression didn't change much, just a slight flicker of surprise, then composure. "Daniel," she said evenly, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I needed to talk," he said. Her tone remained polite. "I'm working. You can wait until closing if it's important." He hesitated but nodded, stepping aside as she continued serving customers. For the next hour he watched. People greeted her warmly, called her by name, thanked her for supporting the local school, praised her pastries. She laughed easily, moved with purpose, and every person she spoke to seemed to leave happier than they arrived. It was a side of her he'd never seen before, or maybe one he'd never cared to notice. When the last customer left, Clara locked the door and turned to face him. "All right," she said quietly. "What do you want?" Daniel exhaled, suddenly unsure where to begin. "I made a mistake." Clara tilted her head. "Which one?" He flinched at the calmness in her voice. "Leaving you. Treating you the way I did. I don't even know why I—" "You wanted control," she interrupted gently. "And when you couldn't have it, you left." He swallowed hard. "You're right. I was young, stupid, ambitious. I thought I could do better." Clara's eyes softened, but her voice stayed steady. "And did you?" He looked down. "No." There was a long pause. The air smelled faintly of vanilla and rain. Finally he said, "The children. They're mine, aren't they?" Clara's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes flickered, a shadow of old pain. "Does it matter now?" "Yes," he said hoarsely. "It matters." She sighed quietly. "They were born after you left. I never told you because you made it clear you didn't want to be part of my life. You had your new world and I had to build mine. Alone." He ran a hand through his hair. "Got Clara? I would've." No, she said firmly. You wouldn't have. You weren't ready. You were too angry, too proud. And honestly, I'm glad you weren't there. Because they grew up happy, Daniel. Well, safe. And I don't regret that. He nodded slowly, guilt washing over him like cold water. Can I see them? She studied him for a long time, then said softly, You already did. They were the ones holding my hands when I arrived at your wedding. He closed his eyes, realizing how blind he'd been. The resemblance was obvious now, the curve of their smiles, the shape of their eyes. He'd been too consumed by pride to notice. When he opened his eyes again, Clara had moved closer. They know about you, she said. But they also know what you did. I won't let them hate you, but I won't rewrite history either. Daniel nodded again quietly. That's fair. She looked at him carefully. You know, I used to wish you'd come back. For years I thought if you just saw me again you'd realize what you threw away. But now, I don't need that anymore. Her words were gentle, but they hit him like a blow. I'm proud of you, he said softly. You did everything I said you couldn't. Clara smiled faintly. Yes, I did. And not to prove you wrong, but to prove to myself that I could. He hesitated before asking, Is there someone else? Her smile deepened slightly, though she didn't answer directly. Maybe there will be someday. But I'm not looking. I'm happy as I am. For a long time neither spoke. The rain outside tapped gently against the window, the sign of the bakery glowing softly in the fading light. Finally Daniel turned to leave. His voice was quiet when he said, Tell them I'm sorry. And that if they ever want to know me, I'll be waiting. Clara nodded once. I will. He opened the door, the bell chiming softly as he stepped out into the rain. For the first time in his life, Daniel Whitmore had no power, no pride left, only regret. When he looked back through the window, he saw Clara laughing with one of her assistants, her face lit with peace. It was a look he'd never been able to give her. As he drove away, the streets blurred past in streaks of gray and gold. The image of her, confident, whole, surrounded by warmth, stayed with him long after he was gone. Back in the bakery, Clara watched the rain and whispered softly, Goodbye, Daniel. Her heart didn't ache anymore. Not like it used to. The pain had faded into something softer, acceptance. She turned off the lights, went upstairs to check on her children. They were asleep, their faces serene. She kissed each of them on the forehead and whispered, You're my greatest success. Outside the rain stopped. The world was quiet. And for the first time in years Clara felt utterly free. 2 months passed since the wedding that had shaken Daniel's world. The story still lingered in whispers, in offices, cafes, and online. People loved the irony of it all. The rich man who tried to humiliate his ex-wife, only to be humiliated by his own arrogance. But Clara had moved on. She refused to let the past keep a seat at her table. Her bakery flourished more than ever. Orders came in from cities she'd never even visited. Her triplets, Ellie, Sophie, and Liam, had become the tiny faces of her brand, their laughter captured in photos that hung on the bakery's walls. Customers adored them. Every morning, Clara woke before sunrise, baked fresh bread, and drove her children to school. The Rolls Royce still turned heads in the little town, though she rarely thought of it as a symbol of wealth anymore. To her, it was simply a reminder of how far she'd come from the nights she used to walk home in the rain with an empty purse and a heavy heart. But life has a way of bringing the past back when you least expect it. One chilly morning, as she arranged a new batch of cupcakes in the display, she heard a knock on the bakery's glass door. The closed sign was still up, but standing outside, drenched from the rain, was Daniel. For a moment she hesitated. Then she unlocked the door. He looked different, thinner, tired, the usual arrogance gone from his eyes. He was holding a small cardboard box, worn and damp around the edges. Clara, he said quietly. I didn't know where else to go. She gestured for him to come in, though her guard was up. You look terrible. Sit down before you fall over. He managed a faint smile. That bad, huh? Worse, she said softly, setting a cup of coffee in front of him. What happened? He exhaled shakily. Everything. Emily filed for divorce. My investors pulled out. I sold the penthouse last week. He paused, staring at the steam curling from the cup. Turns out people only love you when you're winning. Clara didn't say anything for a moment. She knew that feeling too well. She'd once stood in that same hollow space between pride and collapse. I'm sorry, he said finally. For everything. I thought success meant stepping on people. I thought money made me untouchable. But I've learned something. Nothing hurts more than losing the people who truly cared about you. Clara's heart softened slightly, but she stayed composed. I forgave you a long time ago, Daniel. Not for you but for me. I didn't want your mistakes to keep poisoning my peace. He nodded slowly. I don't deserve your kindness. No, she agreed quietly, but forgiveness isn't about deserving. They sat in silence for a while, the rain tapping softly against the window. Then he slid the small box across the table toward her. I found these when I was clearing out my things, he said. She opened the box. Inside were old photographs, their wedding picture, a crumpled sonogram image, a letter she had written years ago but never sent. Clara stared at them, her throat tightening. You kept these? He nodded. I couldn't throw them away. Even when I hated myself for how it ended. She closed the box gently. Some memories are painful but they still matter. They remind us where we went wrong. He smiled faintly. You've become everything I used to pretend to be. Clara looked up, her eyes kind but steady. I became someone you never gave me the chance to be. And maybe that's how it was meant to be. Daniel took a deep breath. Do the children know about me now? They do, she said. I told them you were once someone I loved very much, but that life took us in different directions. They know your name, Daniel. But they also know love isn't measured by what you own, it's measured by what you give. He swallowed hard. Could I meet them properly someday? Clara studied him for a long moment. When they're ready, she said softly. And when you are too. He nodded. That's fair. When he left, the sky had cleared, sunlight filtering through the clouds. Clara watched him go, a quiet ache in her chest. Not love, not regret, but closure. Later that evening, after the bakery closed and the children were tucked in, Clara sat by the window, watching the lights of the city flicker in the distance. She thought about how far she'd come. The humiliation, the heartbreak, the loneliness, all of it had shaped her, sharpened her, made her strong enough to stand on her own. Then her phone buzzed. A message from Nora. Nora, just saw your story on the news again. They're calling you the Queen of Second Chances. You proud? Clara, more than proud. Peaceful. Nora, you deserve every bit of it, love. Clara smiled at the screen. For once, there was no bitterness in her heart, no shadow of resentment. Just quiet gratitude. The next morning, the triplets burst into her room with laughter and sunshine. Mummy, we made breakfast. Liam shouted proudly, holding a tray of toast and slightly burnt eggs. Clara laughed, pulling them close. You three are the best thing that ever happened to me. Ellie grinned. Even better than the bakery? Much better, she said, kissing the top of her head. The bakery feeds people. You feed my heart. That day, as she drove them to school, she stopped briefly at a traffic light and caught sight of a man walking down the pavement. Daniel. He looked up just in time to see her smile through the window. He smiled back, small but genuine. There was no bitterness, no pride, just understanding. When the light turned green, she drove on, the children giggling in the back seat, their little voices filling the car with life. As the Rolls Royce glided down the road, sunlight danced on its surface, catching the gold of the emblem like a quiet symbol of everything she'd overcome. The poor woman who'd once been abandoned had become something Daniel could never buy or control, a woman who knew her worth, who'd built her own kingdom from ashes. And though life had tested her, Clara had won. Not through revenge. Not through pride. But through grace.